The morning Margaret Coleman found the scrawny German shepherd collapsed by her mailbox, she thought she was saving a dying dog. She was wrong. Rex wasn't just any stray. Clutched between his teeth was a silver locket containing a photograph that would shatter everything she believed about her quiet Arizona neighborhood. Dr. Mitchell's hands trembled as he examined the microchip data, his coffee mug crashing to the clinic floor. The registration led to a ranch where children had been disappearing for years. Margaret stared at the photo of 8-year-old Emma Wilson, remembering the news reports from 3 years ago, the girl who died in a tragic accident at Hartwell Ranch. Rex's amber eyes held secrets that could destroy lives, and his scars told a story no one had been brave enough to hear. "We need to call the police," Dr. Mitchell whispered, but Margaret was already reaching for her car keys. What had this dog witnessed, and how many other children were still in danger? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Margaret Coleman had learned the cruel arithmetic of aging over the past 2 years. Friends subtract, family divides, and loneliness multiplies. At 72, she sat in her modest ranch house in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the desert silence stretched as endlessly as her days. The morning sun cast long shadows through windows that Harold used to say needed new curtains, but Harold wasn't there to say much of anything anymore. 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that she was counting. Her husband's coffee mug still occupied the same spot on the kitchen counter, a stubborn monument to routine. Margaret poured coffee for one, but set out 2 cups anyway. Hope was a harder habit to break than grief. The crossword puzzle lay unfinished beside her breakfast, just like every morning since the funeral. 7 across, abandoned one. She knew the answer, but couldn't bring herself to write it. The house groaned with familiar sounds that had once been comforting but now felt accusatory. Harold's workshop remained untouched, tools hanging exactly where he'd left them, waiting for projects that would never be completed. Margaret's nursing certificate hung faded on the hallway wall. 40 years of healing others, and now what? Nobody needed these hands anymore. Her children called once a week. "Duty calls," Harold used to joke, though even those conversations were getting shorter. Sarah in Denver was busy with her law practice and teenage twins. Michael in Boston had his own family drama to navigate. They meant well, but Margaret could hear the relief in their voices when she assured them she was doing just fine. The truth was more complicated. Hidden in her kitchen cabinet behind the salt and pepper shakers sat a bottle of pills that told a different story. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer, Dr. Rodriguez had said 6 weeks ago. The words had hit her like a physical blow, but she'd smiled and asked about treatment options as if discussing the weather. She hadn't told the children. Couldn't bear to become their burden, their obligation, their guilt. Margaret had been a nurse long enough to understand the statistics. 6 months, maybe 9, with aggressive treatment she couldn't afford. Harold's medical bills had already drained their savings, leaving her with a house that needed repairs and a fixed income that barely covered groceries. She'd made peace with the mathematics of it all. The neighborhood had changed since Harold's death. Most of her friends were snowbirds now, migrating south for winter and north for summer, leaving behind empty houses and forwarded mail. Mrs. Patterson next door still waved from her kitchen window, but conversations rarely lasted longer than weather reports and complaints about the postal service. At night, Margaret would sit on her back porch and count the saguaro cacti silhouetted against the star-scattered sky. Harold used to say Arizona sunsets were God's way of apologizing for the heat. Now they just reminded her how many she had left to see. This morning felt different, though, as if the universe was preparing to interrupt her carefully constructed solitude with something that would change everything, Margaret's Tuesday morning routine shattered when she opened her front door to retrieve the newspaper and found him, a skeletal German shepherd, collapsed beside her mailbox, his ribs visible through matted fur. But it wasn't his condition that stopped her breath. It was what he held clenched between his teeth, a silver locket, catching the Arizona sun like a desperate signal. "Oh, honey," she whispered, her nursing instincts overriding everything else. The dog's amber eyes tracked her movement but showed no fear, only exhaustion. Margaret had seen that look before, in patients who had fought too long and too hard, who were ready to surrender everything except hope. Against every practical bone in her body, Margaret lifted the 50-pound dog and carried him inside. Her neighbors would think she'd lost her mind, taking in a stray at her age, but Harold used to say she had a weakness for wounded souls. Some things never change. The dog wouldn't eat from the metal bowl she offered, recoiling as if the sound triggered terrible memories. When she switched to ceramic, he ate slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned that meals might be taken away without warning. Margaret watched him settle under Harold's old reading chair, the same spot where her husband used to fall asleep during Sunday football games. Dr. James Mitchell had been their veterinarian for 15 years and Harold's fishing buddy for longer than that. When Margaret called, she could hear the concern in his voice that went beyond professional courtesy. "Maggie, at your age, taking in a dog this size, just come look at him, Jimmy. Please." Dr. Mitchell arrived within the hour, his weathered hands gentle as he examined the animal. The German shepherd submitted to the inspection with unusual patience, as if he understood this was necessary protocol. "He's been systematically starved," Dr. Mitchell said grimly. "This isn't neglect. This is intentional abuse." The microchip scan made them both freeze. The registration information showed an address Margaret recognized, Hartwell Ranch, about 20 miles outside town. She'd heard the name before, always in the context of tragedy. "Bobby Hartwell lost his boy a few years back," Dr. Mitchell said slowly. "Leukemia. Folks said it broke him. But it was the locket that changed everything." Inside, they found a photograph of a blonde girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with the kind of bright smile that belonged in family Christmas cards. The engraving read, "Emma, Forever Daddy's Girl, 2019. Margaret's trained eye caught what others might miss. The subtle signs of illness in the child's face, the telltale thinness that spoke of medical struggles. "Rex," she said suddenly. The dog's head snapped up at the name, ears alert. "That's your name, isn't it, boy?" His tail gave the faintest wag, the first sign of joy she'd seen from him. That night, Margaret slept on the couch. Rex had claimed the space under Harold's chair, but every few hours she'd wake to find him standing beside her, checking her breathing. The dog seemed to understand something was wrong with her, though she'd been careful to hide her medication routine. By morning, Rex's transformation was remarkable. He followed Margaret through her daily routine like a shadow, demonstrating an intelligence that went far beyond typical pet behavior. When she forgot to take her morning pills, he retrieved the bottle and dropped it at her feet. When she stumbled slightly getting out of bed, he positioned himself as a living brace until she regained her balance. Dr. Mitchell called that afternoon with disturbing news. "Maggie, I've been asking around about that Hartwell place. 3 years ago, a little girl died there. Emma Wilson. Official report said it was an accident during a visit, but..." He paused. Some folks wondered about the details. Margaret's blood turned cold. "What kind of accident?" "Fell into an irrigation canal," they said. But Emma Wilson wasn't just any little girl. She was in a program training service dogs for children with medical conditions. Rex might have been her dog. That evening, Margaret sat with Rex on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The dog rested his head on her lap, and she felt something she hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Purpose. "What happened to her, boy?" she whispered. "What did you see?" Rex's response was to stand and walk to the front door, then look back at her with an expression that needed no translation. He wanted to go somewhere, needed to show her something. Margaret thought about Emma Wilson, about a little girl who died at a ranch where this magnificent dog had been starved and abused. She thought about the locket Rex had carried God knows how far, protecting a child's memory with the last of his strength. Tomorrow, she decided, they would drive to Hartwell Ranch. Tomorrow, she would start asking questions that someone clearly didn't want answered. The drive to Hartwell Ranch took Margaret through 20 miles of desert highway that seemed to stretch into infinity. Rex sat rigid in the passenger seat, his body language shifting from alert to agitated as they approached their destination. When they turned onto the dusty access road, he began to whine, a low, mournful sound that made Margaret's chest tighten. The ranch appeared perfectly normal at first glance. Clean white fencing and enclosed green pastures where several dogs played in the afternoon sun. A freshly painted farmhouse sat surrounded by mature mesquite trees, and the barn looked well maintained. If Margaret hadn't known better, she might have thought it was a model operation. Bobby Hartwell emerged from the house before she'd even parked. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of gaunt frame that spoke of recent weight loss. His smile seemed genuine as he approached her truck, though Margaret noticed he kept glancing nervously at Rex. "Mrs.?" He extended a calloused hand. "Coleman? Margaret Coleman?" She studied his face, looking for signs of the cruelty Rex had obviously endured. "I believe this dog belongs to you." Bobby's expression crumpled with what appeared to be genuine grief. "Rex," he whispered, reaching toward the passenger window. Rex recoiled so violently he nearly climbed into Margaret's lap. "Oh, God, I've been looking for him everywhere. He belonged to my son." The story Bobby told seemed heartbreakingly plausible. His boy Tommy had died of leukemia 2 years ago at age 9. Rex had been Tommy's constant companion through the treatments, the hospital stays, the final weeks. When Tommy passed, Rex just broke, Bobby said, his voice catching. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't play. One night he just ran off into the desert. "I figured the coyotes got him." Margaret watched Bobby's face carefully, her nursing training alert for signs of deception. The man's grief appeared authentic, the hollow eyes, the way his hands shook when he spoke about his son. But Rex's reaction was unmistakable terror. "What about Emma?" Margaret asked quietly, producing the locket. "Emma Wilson?" Bobby's face went very still. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, calculation, fear, before the mask of grief slipped back into place. Emma was Tommy's friend from the Children's Cancer Support Group. She died in an accident here about 3 years ago. Terrible thing. Her family asked me to keep this locket for Tommy, but then he... Bobby's voice trailed off. The story had holes Margaret could drive a truck through, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what felt wrong. Bobby invited her inside for coffee, showing her photos of Tommy, a thin boy with Rex always by his side. The house felt hollow, sterile, like a movie set rather than a home. Medical equipment sat in corners, expensive-looking machines that seemed incongruous with the modest ranch setting. "Tommy's treatments cost everything," Bobby explained, following her gaze. "Insurance only covered so much. I started breeding dogs to help with the bills, but by the time I got established..." He shrugged helplessly. Margaret found herself sympathizing despite Rex's obvious fear. She knew the crushing weight of medical debt, the impossible choices it forced on families. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, meaning it. "I'd like Rex back," Bobby said suddenly. "He's all I have left of Tommy." "I don't think that's a good idea." Margaret kept her voice gentle but firm. He's traumatized, needs medical care I can provide. Maybe after he's recovered. Bobby's expression hardened for just an instant before the grief mask returned. Of course, I understand, but he is legally my property. I have the registration papers. The drive home was tense. Rex remained agitated, constantly looking back toward the ranch. Margaret's mind churned over the conversation, picking at details that didn't quite fit. Emma Wilson had died 3 years ago, but the locket was engraved 2019, 4 years ago. Why would a cancer patient's family ask Bobby to keep a memorial locket? And why did such an apparently cash-strapped operation have thousands of dollars in medical equipment? That evening, Margaret called Dr. Mitchell. "Jimmy, I need you to do me a favor. Look up everything you can about Emma Wilson's death. Maggie, maybe you should leave this alone. A little girl died, and this dog is terrified of the place where it happened. I need to know why." The call came at midnight. Dr. Mitchell's voice was tight with concern. Emma Wilson wasn't in any cancer support group. She was healthy as a horse. She was part of a program training service dogs for other children, children with medical conditions like epilepsy and diabetes. Margaret's blood ran cold. What kind of accident? Drowning, officially. But here's the thing, Maggie. Emma Wilson was a competitive swimmer. She'd been swimming since she was 4. The idea that she accidentally drowned in a shallow irrigation canal. He paused. There were questions, but no evidence of foul play. Case was closed. After hanging up, Margaret sat in the darkness of her living room, Rex pressed against her legs as if sensing her distress. The dog was trying to tell her something, had been trying since the moment they'd found each other. She thought about Bobby's expensive medical equipment, his claim about breeding dogs for money, the way his story about Emma Wilson had shifted when pressed. "What did you see, boy?" she whispered. "What really happened to Emma?" Rex looked up at her with those amber eyes, and Margaret saw something that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just trauma in his gaze, it was guilt. The kind of guilt that came from surviving when someone else didn't. The kind of guilt that came from being unable to save the person you were trained to protect. The investigation consumed Margaret like a fever. Over the next 2 weeks, she found herself diving deeper into Emma Wilson's story, while Rex watched her with those knowing amber eyes. The little girl had been 8 years old when she died, not sick, but vibrant, a champion swimmer who volunteered with a program called Pause for Purpose, training service dogs for children with medical conditions. Margaret's nursing background made her methodical in her research. She drove to the Scottsdale Library every morning, poring over newspaper archives and online records. Emma's obituary mentioned her love of swimming and her work with service animals, but the details of her death remained frustratingly vague. Tragic accident during a ranch visit, the Arizona Republic had reported. Family requests privacy during this difficult time. But children don't just drown in irrigation canals, especially not champion swimmers. Margaret had worked pediatric wards long enough to know that when the official story didn't add up, there was usually a reason. Rex's behavior grew more complex as the days passed. He'd developed routines that went beyond typical pet behavior, bringing Margaret her pills before she remembered to take them, positioning himself strategically when her balance faltered, even learning to open the back door when she was having one of her episodes. The cancer was progressing faster than she'd hoped, though she still hadn't told her children. How could she explain that she was dying while simultaneously trying to solve a 3-year-old mystery? Dr. Mitchell became an unexpected ally in her investigation. As the town's only veterinarian, he had connections throughout the animal community that Margaret couldn't access alone. "I've been asking around about Hartwell Ranch," he told her during one of Rex's checkups. "Interesting thing, Bobby's been buying a lot of medical supplies. Pain medications, antibiotics, surgical equipment, more than you'd need for normal breeding operations. What would he need that for? Could be legitimate. Breeding operations do need veterinary supplies, but the quantities— Jimmy shook his head. And some of these medications are controlled substances. You need special licenses for that kind of thing. Margaret felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, though the picture they formed was still unclear. Jimmy, has anyone ever reported missing dogs in this area? The veterinarian's expression grew troubled. You know, now that you mention it, there have been several over the past few years. Purebred dogs, mostly, German shepherds, golden retrievers, Labradors, the kinds of dogs that make good service animals. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat on her back porch with Rex, watching the desert stars and thinking about Emma Wilson. A healthy 8-year-old swimmer, training service dogs, dies in a shallow canal at a ranch where expensive medical equipment was being stockpiled and purebred dogs were disappearing. The mathematics of it felt all wrong. Rex suddenly stood and walked to the edge of the porch, staring into the darkness toward the direction of Hartwell Ranch. His posture was alert, protective, as if he sensed danger approaching. Margaret was learning to trust the dog's instincts. They'd proven more reliable than her own lately. The phone call came the next morning. Bobby Hartwell's voice was strained, desperate. Mrs. Coleman, I need Rex back. I know you mean well, but he's legally my property, and I'm prepared to involve the authorities if necessary. Mr. Hartwell, Rex is recovering from severe trauma. Moving him now could cause a setback. I don't care about setbacks. The mask of grief slipped, revealing something harder underneath. That dog is mine. My son loved him, and I won't let some interfering old woman steal what's left of my boy's memory. The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her hands trembling slightly. Whether from fear or anger, she wasn't sure. Rex had positioned himself between her and the front door, as if anticipating trouble. Her daughter's call came an hour later. Mom, you sound tired. Are you taking care of yourself? Sarah's voice carried the particular tone of adult children who suspect their parents are hiding something. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just busy with a new project. What kind of project? Margaret hesitated. How could she explain that she was investigating a potential crime while dying of cancer and hiding a dog from its possibly dangerous owner? Just some volunteer work. Nothing to worry about. But Sarah had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and her father's investigative instincts. Mom, Michael and I have been talking. We think maybe it's time to consider some changes. There are wonderful senior communities in Phoenix with full medical facilities. I'm not ready for that conversation, Sarah. When will you be ready? When something happens and we're too far away to help. After hanging up, Margaret realized her time was running out on multiple fronts. The cancer was sapping her energy faster each day, her children were getting suspicious, and Bobby Hartwell was escalating his demands. Meanwhile, Rex continued to show signs that he was trying to communicate something urgent. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor, knocked on Margaret's door Tuesday evening with a casserole and gossip. That nice Dr. Mitchell told me you're looking into that poor little girl who died at the Hartwell place, she said, settling onto Margaret's couch like she planned to stay a while. I knew Emma's grandmother, God rest her soul. Lovely woman. Used to talk about how proud she was of that little girl's work with the dogs. What kind of work? Emma wasn't just training regular service dogs, Mrs. Patterson said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. She was working with dogs that could detect medical emergencies, seizures, diabetic episodes, that sort of thing. Very specialized training. Very valuable. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Valuable how? Oh, my dear, those dogs can sell for $20,000–$30,000 each, maybe more if they're properly trained. Emma's program was producing some of the best medical alert dogs in the Southwest. The pieces suddenly snapped together with horrifying clarity. Emma Wilson hadn't died in an accident. She'd discovered something at Hartwell Ranch that got her killed. The expensive medical equipment, the missing purebred dogs, Bobby's desperate need for money. He wasn't just running a breeding operation. He was stealing and retraining service dogs for black market sales. Rex had been Emma's partner in the program. He'd witnessed her murder and somehow escaped, carrying her locket as evidence. For 3 years he'd been trying to find someone who would listen, someone who would help him seek justice for his fallen partner. "Oh, Rex," Margaret whispered, stroking the dog's head. "You've been carrying this burden all alone, haven't you?" As if responding to her understanding, Rex stood and walked to the front door. He looked back at her with an expression she now recognized, determination mixed with trust. He was ready to go back, ready to finish what Emma had started. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging or you'll end up like the girl." Her hands shook as she showed the message to Rex. The dog's reaction was immediate and protective. He positioned himself between Margaret and the front window, hackles raised, every muscle tense. Someone was watching them. Someone knew exactly how close they were to the truth. Margaret realized with crystal clarity that she had a choice to make. She could back down, return Rex to Bobby Hartwell, and spend her remaining months in quiet safety. Or she could trust the bond she'd formed with this remarkable dog and see justice done for a murdered child. Rex looked up at her with those amber eyes, and Margaret saw something that decided everything: hope. For the first time since Emma's death, Rex believed someone might actually listen. Someone might actually fight. "Okay, boy," she said quietly. "But we're going to need help." The confrontation Margaret had been dreading arrived on a scorching Thursday afternoon when Rex began pacing frantically around the house, his agitation reaching levels she'd never seen before. His behavior reminded her of patients she'd treated who could sense incoming storms, an animal awareness that something dangerous was approaching. At 3:15, Bobby Hartwell's pickup truck pulled into her driveway. Margaret watched through her front window as he climbed out, no longer bothering to maintain the grieving father facade. His movements were sharp, aggressive, and when he knocked on her door, it sounded more like demands than requests. "Mrs. Coleman, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Rex had positioned himself between Margaret and the door, every muscle coiled tight. His amber eyes held a look she'd seen before, the same protective stance he must have taken with Emma Wilson. Margaret's nursing instincts screamed danger, but her stubborn pride refused to back down. As she opened the door but kept the screen door latched. "Mr. Hartwell, I want my dog back. Now." Bobby's face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the late afternoon shade. "I know you've been asking questions around town, stirring up trouble. That needs to stop." "What kind of trouble would the truth cause you, Mr. Hartwell?" The mask slipped completely. Bobby's eyes hardened, and Margaret saw what Rex had recognized immediately. This man was capable of violence. "You have no idea what you're messing with, old woman. Some sleeping dogs are better left alone." "Like Emma Wilson was a sleeping dog?" The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Bobby's hand moved to his belt, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something metallic. Behind her, Rex's growl rumbled low and continuous. "That little girl was where she didn't belong, just like you are now." Bobby's voice had dropped to something cold and deadly. "Accidents happen to people who can't mind their own business." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hartwell?" I'm warning you, last chance to return what's mine and forget whatever stories you think you've uncovered. And if I don't? Bobby's smile was arctic. Desert's a dangerous place for someone your age. Easy to get lost, have a medical emergency where nobody can find you in time. Tragic, really. The threat was clear enough. Margaret realized that Bobby knew about her cancer somehow, had probably been watching her, gathering information, planning his approach. The thought sent ice through her veins, but also sparked something she hadn't felt in months. Fighting fury. "Get off my property," she said quietly. "I'll be back tomorrow with the sheriff and a court order. Have my dog ready." Bobby turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Coleman." "I'd avoid any more trips to the library if I were you. Research can be hazardous to your health." After he left, Margaret double-checked all her locks and called Dr. Mitchell. "Jimmy, I need you to come over. Tonight. And maybe you should bring that friend of yours from the sheriff's department." Officer Lisa Rodriguez arrived with Dr. Mitchell an hour after sunset. Margaret had known Lisa since she was a teenager. She'd been one of Margaret's patients after a riding accident that shattered her pelbo. Now she was a deputy sheriff with a specialty in animal cruelty cases. "Mrs. Coleman, Dr. Mitchell filled me in on some of your concerns about Hartwell Ranch." Lisa's voice carried the careful neutrality of law enforcement, but her eyes showed genuine worry. "I have to tell you, we've had Bobby on our radar for a while." Margaret felt a surge of hope. "What kind of radar? Off the record? We've had reports about unusual activity at his place. Vehicles coming and going at odd hours, strange sounds, neighbors complaining about constant dog barking that suddenly stops. But every time we've done welfare checks, everything appears normal." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward. "Lisa, show her the reports." Lisa hesitated, then pulled out a folder. "These are incident reports from the past 3 years. Dogs matching specific breeds and training levels going missing throughout Arizona and New Mexico. All high-value animals, service dogs, therapy dogs, search and rescue dogs. The pattern suggests someone with inside knowledge of dog training programs." Margaret studied the reports, her nurse's eye catching patterns that might escape others. "These dates, they correspond with full moons." "What do you mean?" "Bobby mentioned something about breeding cycles, but that doesn't make sense for the timeline. Unless—" Margaret's blood went cold. "Unless he's timing shipments. Moving stolen dogs under cover of darkness when people are less likely to notice unusual activity." Rex had been listening intently to their conversation, and now he stood and walked to the back door. He looked over his shoulder at Margaret with an expression she'd learned to recognize. He wanted to show them something. "He wants us to follow him," Margaret said. Lisa frowned. "Mrs. Coleman, it's dark, and if your suspicions about Bobby are correct, it could be dangerous to—" "Officer Rodriguez," Margaret interrupted. "Rex was Emma Wilson's partner. If anyone knows what happened to that little girl and where the evidence might be, it's him." Against her better judgment, Lisa agreed to follow Rex's lead. They drove in her patrol car toward Hartwell Ranch, but Rex directed them past the main entrance to a service road Margaret hadn't noticed before. The road led to what appeared to be abandoned buildings about a mile from the main ranch. "These are the old Grayson place," Lisa said quietly. "Been empty for years. Bobby bought the property when old man Grayson died, but I didn't know there were still structures here." Rex led them to a concrete building that looked like it might have been a storage facility or workshop. The windows were painted black, and Margaret could hear the faint sound of dogs barking from inside. The sound was wrong, though, desperate, frightened, nothing like the happy dogs they'd seen at the main ranch. "Jesus," Dr. Mitchell whispered. "Lisa, we need to get a warrant." "We need probable cause for a warrant. An old woman's suspicions and a dog's behavior won't be enough for a judge." Rex suddenly bolted toward the building, disappearing around the back corner. They followed and found him pawing at what looked like a storm cellar door, whining and looking back at them urgently. Lisa pulled out her flashlight and examined the door. "This lock's been cut recently." "The metal's still bright where the bolt cutters hit it?" Margaret's heart was pounding from more than just the cancer and exertion. "Rex knows what's down there." Dr. Mitchell was already pulling open the heavy door. The smell that wafted up was unmistakable to anyone who'd worked in medical settings. Disinfectant mixed with fear and suffering. And underneath it all, the distinctive odor of too many animals in too small a space. "My God," Lisa breathed, shining her light down the stairs. The basement was larger than the building above suggested, obviously excavated and expanded. Dozens of dogs were caged in conditions that made Margaret's stomach turn. These weren't the healthy, happy animals from the main ranch. These were the stolen service dogs, many showing signs of abuse and forced retraining. But it was what Rex led them to in the corner that made Lisa immediately radio for backup. A child's backpack, water-damaged but intact, with Emma Wilson written in purple marker on the name tag. Inside, they found a notebook filled with Emma's observations about the illegal operation, including dates, license plate numbers, and detailed descriptions of the underground facility. Emma Wilson hadn't died in an accident. She'd been murdered to silence her investigation into the largest service dog theft ring in the Southwest. Rex sat beside the backpack and looked up at Margaret with an expression of profound relief. After 3 years of carrying the truth alone, someone finally understood. The sound of vehicles approaching made them all freeze. Lisa drew her weapon and motioned for Margaret and Dr. Mitchell to stay behind her. Bobby Hartwell's voice echoed down from above. "I know you're down there. Come up now, and maybe we can work something out." Margaret realized they were trapped. Bobby had been watching them, waiting for exactly this moment. And now they were all witnesses to his crimes. The basement fell silent, except for the whimpering of caged dogs and Margaret's labored breathing. Her cancer-weakened body was struggling with the stress and exertion, but her mind remained sharp enough to understand their desperate situation. Bobby Hartwell had them trapped underground with evidence of his crimes, and men like him didn't leave witnesses. "Mrs. Coleman?" Bobby's voice carried down the concrete stairs, deceptively cheerful. "I know you're down there with that dog and whoever else you brought. Time to come up and have a civilized conversation." Officer Rodriguez whispered urgently into her radio, but the underground location was blocking her signal. They were on their own until backup could locate them, and Bobby clearly wasn't planning to wait long. Rex pressed against Margaret's legs, his body vibrating with barely contained energy. In the dim light of Lisa's flashlight, Margaret could see the dog's amber eyes fixed on something in the shadows. Another stairway at the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind stacked cages. Dr. Mitchell caught her attention and pointed to the caged dogs. Many were showing signs of severe psychological trauma, but a few of the larger German Shepherds and Golden Retrievers were alert, watching the humans with an intelligence that suggested they'd retained their service dog training despite months of abuse. "These dogs," Margaret whispered to Lisa, "they're trained to help people in crisis situations." Lisa understood immediately. If they could somehow release the dogs, the chaos might provide cover for an escape attempt. But the risk was enormous. Traumatized animals were unpredictable, and Bobby was armed. Margaret's breathing became more labored, and she recognized the warning signs of an episode. The stress was triggering her cancer symptoms, and she could feel her blood pressure spiking dangerously. Rex noticed immediately, positioning himself to support her weight as her legs threatened to buckle. "Margaret!" Dr. Mitchell moved to help her, but she waved him away. "I'm fine," she gasped, though they all knew she wasn't. "Just need a moment." Bobby's patience ran out. Heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete stairs as he descended, accompanied by at least 2 other men. Margaret could hear their voices, rough, businesslike discussions about cleaning up the mess and making it look like an accident. Well, Bobby said as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his voice filled with mock concern. "Margaret Coleman, playing detective at her age. And, Officer Rodriguez, this is unfortunate. I really hoped we could avoid involving law enforcement directly." Lisa had her weapon drawn but was clearly calculating odds. 3 armed men with the tactical advantage of knowing the layout versus herself, an elderly woman having a medical crisis, and a veterinarian. Rex was their only wild card. "Bobby Hartwell, you're under arrest for—" Lisa began, but Bobby cut her off with harsh laughter. "Under arrest? Down here? I don't think you understand the situation, officer. This is private property, and you're trespassing. When your bodies are found, it'll be clear that you broke in illegally and suffered an unfortunate accident." Margaret forced herself to focus through the pain and dizziness. Emma Wilson had been 8 years old when she'd faced this same monster, but she'd managed to document everything before he killed her. That little girl had been braver than most adults Margaret knew. "Emma figured it out, didn't she?" Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "She discovered your operation and tried to expose you." Bobby's expression darkened. "That little bitch was supposed to be training dogs for sick kids. Instead, she was playing detective, taking pictures, writing everything down like some kind of junior cop. She threatened to ruin everything. So you murdered her." "I defended my business." Bobby's composure cracked completely. "Do you have any idea how much money was at stake? These service dogs sell for $30,000 each on the black market. Emma Wilson was going to destroy a $1 million operation over some misguided sense of justice." Dr. Mitchell stepped protectively in front of Margaret. "Bobby, this has gone far enough. Let us go and we can—" "Nobody's going anywhere." Bobby nodded to his men, who began moving to surround them. "The old woman's health problems will explain her death. Heart attack brought on by breaking and entering. Very sad. And Officer Rodriguez. Well, accidents happen to cops who stick their noses where they don't belong." That's when Rex made his move. The German Shepherd launched himself not at Bobby, but at the nearest cage latch. His training and intelligence had been working on the problem while the humans talked. He'd identified the mechanical advantage needed to spring the locks. The first cage opened, releasing a golden retriever who immediately understood the situation and began working on other latches. Within seconds, a dozen traumatized but highly trained dogs were free, and their service dog instincts overrode their fear. Chaos erupted in the basement. Bobby's men shouted and stumbled in the darkness as dogs, some protective and others simply desperate to escape, surged around them. Lisa used the confusion to tackle one of the men, while Dr. Mitchell grabbed Margaret and started pulling her toward the hidden stairway Rex had spotted. But Margaret's body chose that moment to betray her completely. The stress, the cancer, the emotional overload, it all crashed down at once. Her legs gave out and she collapsed against a concrete wall, her vision graying at the edges. "Go!" she gasped to Dr. Mitchell. "Get help!" Rex appeared beside her, pressing his warm body against hers, his presence the only thing keeping her conscious. Through the mayhem, she could hear Bobby screaming orders, the sound of a gunshot, and Lisa shouting into her radio as her signal finally connected. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she was going to die in this basement, surrounded by the evidence of a murdered child's courage and a dog's 3-year quest for justice. But maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to finally end Bobby Hartwell's reign of cruelty. Rex looked into her eyes, and she saw understanding there. He'd found someone willing to fight for Emma Wilson, even if it cost them everything. The gunshot that echoed through the basement belonged to Officer Rodriguez, fired into the concrete ceiling to restore order among the panicking men and traumatized dogs. In the sudden silence that followed, Margaret heard something that changed everything, the distant wail of sirens approaching fast. "Backup's coming, Bobby," Lisa called out, her weapon trained on Hartwell while she pressed her shoulder radio. "Multiple units, Federal Task Force. This is over." But Bobby Hartwell was beyond rational thinking now. 3 years of building his criminal empire, millions of dollars in stolen service dogs, and the weight of Emma Wilson's murder had driven him to a desperate edge. "No," he snarled, raising his own weapon. "I'm not going to prison for some dead brat and a bunch of mutts." Margaret, still collapsed against the concrete wall with Rex pressed protectively against her side, watched the scene unfold with a strange sense of detachment. The cancer medication and adrenaline had created an almost dreamlike state where time seemed to move in slow motion. She could see Bobby's finger tightening on the trigger, aimed not at Lisa, but at the caged dogs, his twisted logic telling him that destroying the evidence would somehow save him. That's when Rex made a choice that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. The German Shepherd launched himself across the 15 feet separating them from Bobby with the speed and precision of a dog trained for protection work. But Bobby's reflexes were faster than anyone expected. The gun swung toward Rex mid-leap, and the basement filled with the deafening crack of another gunshot. Rex hit the ground and didn't get up. "No!" Margaret's scream came from somewhere deep in her soul, a sound of loss that encompassed Harold's death, her own approaching mortality, and now the sacrifice of the most noble creature she'd ever known. She tried to crawl toward Rex, but her body wouldn't obey. The chaos that followed seemed to happen in fast forward. Lisa tackled Bobby while he was off balance from Rex's impact. Dr. Mitchell reached the hidden stairway and began shouting directions to the incoming officers. The sirens grew louder until the basement filled with the sound of heavy boots and authoritative voices, but Margaret's world had narrowed to Rex's still form in the dim light. Blood pooled beneath his chest, and his amber eyes were growing glassy. She dragged herself across the concrete floor, her own pain forgotten in the face of his sacrifice. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, cradling his massive head in her lap. "You did it. You saved them all. Emma would be so proud." Rex's eyes focused on her face with tremendous effort. His tail moved once, barely a flutter, and then he was still. Margaret felt something break inside her that had nothing to do with cancer. This dog had spent 3 years carrying the burden of Emma Wilson's murder, had somehow found the strength to seek justice, and had ultimately given his life to protect others. The cruelty of it seemed unbearable. Federal agents swarmed the basement. Apparently, Lisa's call had triggered a multi-agency response that had been building for months. Margaret learned later that Rex and Emma's story was the missing piece in a federal investigation into interstate trafficking of service animals. But in that moment, all she could think about was the still weight of the dog in her arms. "Ma'am, we need to get you medical attention," a young paramedic said, kneeling beside her. Margaret recognized the look in his eyes, the professional assessment of someone whose body was shutting down under stress. "I'm not leaving him." "Ma'am, I said I'm not leaving him." The force of her words surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. Here was a woman who'd spent her life following rules, being reasonable, accommodating others' needs. But Rex had taught her something about loyalty that transcended practicality. "Doctor." Mitchell appeared beside her, his face grim. "Margaret, let me check him." Hope flared in her chest as Jimmy's experienced hands moved over Rex's body. The veterinarian worked in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, he looked up with an expression Margaret couldn't read. The bullet went through his shoulder, missed the vital organs. "He's lost a lot of blood, but—" Jimmy's voice caught. "He's got a strong heart, this one. If we can get him to the animal hospital immediately." Margaret felt tears she didn't know she'd been holding back spill down her cheeks. Will he make it? I don't know, but he's got the best reason in the world to fight. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of emergency rooms, police statements, and phone calls. Margaret's children rushed to Arizona on the first available flights, finally learning about her cancer diagnosis from the attending physician rather than from her. The confrontation she'd been dreading for months happened in a hospital waiting room while Rex fought for his life in surgery. "Mom, how could you hide something like this from us?" Sarah's voice carried the particular pain of adult children who realize their parent is mortal. "I didn't want to be a burden," Margaret said simply. "A burden?" Michael's voice cracked. "Mom, you're our mother. Taking care of you isn't a burden. It's a privilege." But Margaret's attention kept drifting to the surgery doors where Dr. Mitchell was working on Rex. The local news had picked up the story. Elderly woman and heroic dog expose criminal operation. And the waiting room gradually filled with strangers who'd come to check on Rex's condition. Officer Rodriguez appeared around midnight, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Bobby Hartwell's talking," she told Margaret quietly. "Federal prosecutors think they can connect him to at least 15 murders across 4 states. Emma Wilson wasn't his first victim, just the youngest." Margaret felt sick. 15? People who got too close to his operation. He's been at this for over a decade, started small and grew into one of the largest illegal animal trafficking rings in the country. The dogs we found tonight are worth over $2 million in black market sales. What about Emma's family? Lisa's expression softened. They've been contacted. Emma's father is flying in tomorrow. He's been investigating her death privately for 3 years, never believed the official story. Rex's testimony, if that's what we can call it, finally gives them closure. At 3 in the morning, Dr. Mitchell emerged from surgery. His scrubs were blood-stained, and his face showed the exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting death for hours. "He made it through surgery," he said without preamble, "but the next 24 hours are critical. He's lost a lot of blood and the trauma to his system." Jimmy shrugged helplessly. "He's a fighter, but his body's been through hell for years." Margaret nodded, understanding the subtext. Rex had been systematically starved and abused for 3 years, his body weakened by chronic stress and malnutrition. The gunshot might heal, but the cumulative damage might be too much for even his strong spirit to overcome. "Can I see him?" "Margaret, you need medical attention yourself. The stress of tonight triggered some serious symptoms, and your oncologist needs to—" "Can I see him?" she repeated, and something in her voice made Jimmy nod. Rex lay unconscious in the recovery room, connected to monitors and IV lines that looked eerily similar to the equipment that had surrounded Harold during his final weeks. But where Harold had looked, diminished by illness, Rex somehow appeared noble even in unconsciousness. His breathing was steady, and his ears twitched slightly when Margaret spoke to him. "You did it, boy," she whispered, stroking his head carefully around the bandages. "Emma's killer is going to prison. All those stolen dogs are going home. You finished what she started." Rex's eyes opened slightly, unfocused but aware. He seemed to look directly at her, and Margaret could swear she saw peace in his gaze for the first time since they'd found each other. "Rest now," she said softly. "You've earned it." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret realized that Rex's fight was far from over. And neither was hers. 6 months later, Margaret Coleman stood in the sunlit courtyard of what had once been Bobby Hartwell's ranch, watching Rex demonstrate basic commands to a group of children from the local special needs program. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, both in the dog and in the place that had once housed so much suffering. Rex's recovery had been slow and uncertain. For weeks after the shooting, he'd barely eaten. his spirit seeming as wounded as his body. The veterinary team had warned Margaret that traumatized animals sometimes simply gave up, their will to live broken by too much pain. But Margaret had refused to accept that possibility. She'd moved a cot into the animal hospital and spent every night beside Rex's recovery cage, reading to him from Harold's favorite books and sharing stories about Emma Wilson that she'd learned from the little girl's father. Gradually, Rex began to respond, first with subtle ear movements when Margaret spoke, then with the faintest tail wags, and finally with the return of his remarkable intelligence and protective instincts. The physical wounds healed faster than anyone expected, Dr. Mitchell had told her during one of their many conversations about Rex's progress. But you healed something deeper in him, Margaret. You gave him back his purpose. That purpose had evolved into something Margaret never could have imagined when she first found Rex collapsed by her mailbox. The federal investigation into Bobby Hartwell's operation had uncovered a network of animal trafficking that stretched across multiple states, involving hundreds of stolen service dogs and the murders of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Emma Wilson's notebook, preserved in her water-damaged backpack, had become crucial evidence in prosecuting not just Bobby, but his entire organization. The trial had been a media sensation. Now, Margaret found herself testifying before federal judges, her story of rescuing Rex capturing national attention. But it was Rex himself who became the star witness, his trained responses to specific commands proving his connection to Emma's service dog program, his visible trauma supporting the prosecution's case about systematic abuse. Bobby Hartwell received life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, he'd looked directly at Margaret and said something that still haunted her. "I loved my son more than anything in this world. Everything I did was for him." The complexity of that truth, that love could be twisted into justification for monstrous acts, had forced Margaret to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, forgiveness, and the thin line between desperation and evil. Margaret's own health had stabilized in ways that surprised her oncologist. "Sometimes, Dr. Rodriguez had told her during a recent checkup, having a strong sense of purpose can extend life beyond what medical science predicts. Your cancer is still there, but it's responding better to treatment than we hoped." Margaret suspected that Rex's recovery had somehow fueled her own, two damaged souls healing each other through the simple act of refusing to give up. Her children had initially been furious about her decision to keep Rex and establish what became known as Rex's Haven, a sanctuary for rescued service dogs on the grounds of the former Hartwell Ranch. But gradually they'd come to understand that their mother had found something worth living for beyond doctor's appointments and quiet resignation. "I've never seen her so alive," Sarah had confided to Dr. Mitchell during one of her monthly visits from Denver. "Even before Dad got sick, she was starting to fade. Now look at her." Margaret was indeed transformed. The woman who'd once hidden her cancer diagnosis and prepared to die alone was now a national advocate for animal welfare reform. Rex's Haven had rescued and rehabilitated over 200 dogs in 6 months, many of them stolen service animals whose return to their original families had created moments of joy that made national news. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Margaret. Evenings when she and Rex would sit on the porch of the small house she'd built on the sanctuary grounds, watching the Arizona sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Rex would rest his head on her lap, both of them scarred but healing, both of them survivors of different kinds of trauma. Rex's relationship with Emma Wilson's father, David, had been particularly moving to witness. The man had flown to Arizona the day after the basement confrontation and had barely left Rex's side during the dog's recovery. David Wilson was a quiet man, an engineer who'd spent 3 years conducting his own investigation into his daughter's death, never accepting the official story. Emma loved this dog more than anything, David had told Margaret during one of his visits. When they told me she'd drowned, I knew it was impossible. Emma could swim before she could walk properly. But when they showed me Rex's collar floating in the irrigation canal, his voice had broken. I thought I'd lost them both. The reunion between David and Rex had been captured by news cameras, but Margaret remembered the private moment afterward when David had knelt beside Rex's hospital bed and whispered, "She would be so proud of you, boy. You never gave up on her." Rex had somehow understood. His recovery accelerated dramatically after David's arrival, as if reconnecting with Emma's memory had restored something essential in his spirit. Now, 6 months later, Rex split his time between the sanctuary and visits with David's family, including Emma's younger brother who'd been only 5 when his sister died. The sanctuary itself had become a model for animal rescue operations nationwide. Federal grants and private donations poured in after the trial, allowing Margaret to hire professional staff and expand their rehabilitation programs. Former law enforcement canines, retired service dogs, and animals rescued from trafficking operations all found homes and healing at Rex's Haven. Margaret's favorite part of each day was the afternoon training sessions where Rex worked with children who were learning to handle service dogs. His patience was infinite, his intelligence remarkable, and his ability to sense when a child was struggling, whether physically or emotionally, seemed almost supernatural. "Rex has an unusual gift," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist who supervised the program. "He seems to understand that his role now is to teach both dogs and children how to trust again after trauma." Today's session was special because they were welcoming a new group of children, including 7-year-old Miguel, whose seizure disorder had left him afraid of many normal childhood activities. Rex approached the boy with characteristic gentleness, somehow sensing that Miguel needed extra patience. Margaret watched from the shade of a ramada as Rex demonstrated how to properly fit a service dog's harness, his calm presence helping Miguel overcome his initial nervousness. The boy's face lit up with wonder as Rex responded to his uncertain commands, and Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with cancer and everything to do with witnessing small miracles. "Mrs. Coleman?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret turned to see a young woman with a notebook and press credentials. "I'm Jessica Martinez from the Arizona Republic. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about the anniversary." Margaret nodded. Tomorrow marked exactly 1 year since Emma Wilson's murder, and various media outlets were running follow-up stories about the case and its aftermath. She'd learned to handle interviews with the same patience Rex showed the children, understanding that telling their story might help other animals and prevent future tragedies. "What would you want people to understand about Emma Wilson?" Jessica asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. Emma was 8 years old when she died, but she had the courage to do what adults had failed to do for years. She saw injustice and refused to look away, even when it put her in danger. Rex carried that legacy for 3 years, until he found someone willing to listen. "And what about Rex's role in all this?" "Rex taught me that loyalty doesn't end with death," Margaret said, watching the dog work with Miguel. "He spent 3 years seeking justice for his partner, never giving up hope that someone would help him finish what she started. In the end, he saved more than just those stolen dogs. He saved me from giving up on myself." As if sensing he was being discussed, Rex looked over at Margaret and offered the gentle tail wag that had become his signature greeting. The bullet scar on his shoulder was still visible, a permanent reminder of his sacrifice. But his eyes held the peace that comes from completing an important mission. Margaret smiled back at him, understanding something Harold used to tell her about the arithmetic of love. It doesn't divide when shared. It multiplies. Rex had taught her that healing wasn't about forgetting trauma, but about transforming it into purpose, turning survival into service. The Arizona sun was setting behind the Sonoran Mountains, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that had once reminded Margaret only of endings. Now they looked like beginnings. And sometimes the greatest rescue missions begin when we're the ones who need rescuing most. Margaret Coleman thought she was saving a dying dog, but Rex was actually saving her. From loneliness, from purposelessness, from the quiet resignation that creeps in when we feel forgotten by the world. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to find meaning, to fight for justice, or to discover that our greatest adventures might still be ahead of us. When Margaret's children worried she was too old to take on such challenges, she proved that age brings wisdom, courage, and the kind of stubborn determination that can change everything. Rex taught her that loyalty doesn't end with loss, that love multiplies when shared, and that sometimes a wounded heart is exactly what's needed to heal another wounded soul. From a chance encounter at a mailbox to building a nationally recognized animal sanctuary, their journey shows us that life's most important chapters can begin at any age. Rex's Haven stands as proof that when we choose purpose over comfort, hope over resignation, we don't just survive our trials, we transform them into something beautiful that serves others for generations to come. What unexpected encounter has changed your life's direction? Have you ever discovered that helping someone else actually healed something broken in yourself? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you found purpose in unexpected places.